The morning she arrived at Highmore, I watched my master break a teacup with his bare hand and tell me it had slipped. It had not slipped. I had dressed that man for 11 years, had shaved his jaw 1,000 mornings, had learned the particular silence that meant leave me be and the different, colder silence that meant I am drowning and will not say so. I knew the sound of a cup set down too hard by a man whose hand had simply closed too tight around it, as though he might, for one unwatched moment, crush something on purpose. I said nothing. I swept the shards into my palm and set a fresh cup at his elbow, and he did not thank me, because he had not properly thanked anyone for anything in 2 years, not since the black-bordered letter came from the Admiralty telling him that his brother, Lord Edmund Ashworth, had gone down with his ship off the Breton coast and would not be coming home to Highmore. Not now, not ever. They called him the Raven Duke below stairs, and above stairs too, though never where he could hear it. Not merely for the black he wore past the year of mourning proper, into a second year and now creeping toward a third, but for the way he had gone silent and watchful, stalking the corridors of that great house like something that had forgotten how to roost. He had been a warm young man once, before the news came, laughing at his brother's terrible jokes, riding out with the tenants at harvest, never flinching at his own mother's voice in the hall. That man was still in there. I had simply stopped being sure, some months, that we would ever see him again. It was the 3rd week of October, the leaves going red and gold along the drive, when the carriage came up from the village station, and a young woman stepped down into the gravel with a single trunk and no maid of her own, and the Duke did not so much as come to the window to see who his mother had hired. I went down myself, someone had to. "Mrs. Alder," she said, giving me her hand as though I were the master of the house, and she a guest who meant to be gracious about it regardless. "I believe I'm expected." I want to say I knew, in that first moment, what she would come to mean to this house. I did not. I saw a woman perhaps 24 in a gray traveling gown gone soft at the seams, her hair the color of good wheat under a plain bonnet, and eyes that took in the whole facade of Highmore, its dark stone, its shuttered west wing, its general air of a house that had stopped expecting anyone to come home, without flinching and without pity, which was rarer than either. "Her Grace has been told you'd come today," I said. "I'm Barrow. I have charge of the household in most matters that don't concern the estate ledgers. And those concern His Grace alone, I take it." "His Grace concerns himself with a great many things, ma'am. It leaves him very little time for anything else." She looked at me then with something that might have been the first flicker of understanding, though she could not have known yet what she was understanding. "I was told the same of my late husband's captain," she said. "Busy men make excellent hiding places out of their business." I did not answer that, because it was true, and because I did not yet know that she had buried a husband of her own, a lieutenant in His Majesty's Navy, lost at sea not 11 months before Lord Edmund had gone down not 40 miles from where her husband's ship had foundered. I did not know that the 2 griefs in that house were about to be joined by a third that nobody had thought to ask after, because widows hired as companions are not generally imagined to be grieving anything themselves. They are imagined to be useful. She was far more than that. But I am ahead of myself, and Barrow's stories run in better order. I brought her up to the yellow drawing-room, where the Dowager Duchess sat, as she had sat nearly every afternoon for 2 years, with her needlework abandoned in her lap, and her eyes on the window that looked out toward the sea she could not see, but always seemed to be listening for. "Your Grace," I said, "Mrs. Alder has arrived." The Duchess did not turn at once. She had grown terribly practiced at not turning toward things, as though delay might soften whatever news waited. When she did look, something in her thin shoulders eased a fraction, the way a person eases who has been braced for a stranger and found instead a kind of recognition. "Sit with me," the Duchess said, which was not how she greeted anyone anymore, and Mrs. Alder sat, and I withdrew to the sideboard to see about tea, and did not, I confess, withdraw so far that I could not hear. They tell me you're a widow, the Duchess said, without preamble, because grief had burned the preambles out of her the way it burns everything soft and unnecessary out of a person eventually. I am your Grace, 2 years this December. My husband was a lieutenant aboard the Intrepid. The Duchess's hand found the arm of her chair. The Intrepid went down in the same engagement that took my son. I know it, your Grace. I asked before I came whether that would trouble you. I did not want to bring the wound into the room disguised as a comfort. I nearly dropped the tea tray. In 11 years I had not heard a soul speak so plainly to the Duchess about her grief. Not the physician, not the vicar, not her own son, who could not sit with his mother's sorrow longer than it took to inquire, with terrible correctness, whether she wanted for anything, before he fled to his study, and the fortress he had built out of estate business. The Duchess did not weep, though her eyes were bright. Most people, she said, speak to me as though my son were a subject requiring delicate handling, like a hot dish passed round a table too quickly. You speak of him as though he were simply a man who died, which he was. He was, your Grace, so was mine. I find it does neither of them justice to pretend otherwise. You are hired to be my companion, Mrs. Alder, not my confessor. I can be both, if your Grace requires it. Or neither, if you'd rather I confine myself to reading you the newspapers and losing gracefully at cards. Something that might, in a kinder year, have been a laugh moved through the Duchess's face and did not quite arrive. You had better read to me first, she said. We'll see about the confessing. That was the whole of it, that first afternoon. But I carried the tea things down with my hands not quite steady, because I had just watched a woman do in 10 minutes what none of us had managed in 2 years, sit in a room with the Duchess's grief, without running from it or drowning in it alongside her. I did not think it would matter half so much to the Duke. I ought to have known better. Grief in a house does not stay in the room where it is welcomed. It goes looking for every door left open a crack, and there was hardly a door more tightly shut than his. The Duke did not meet her for 4 days, which I attributed at the time to the accounts at Michaelmas, and have since come to understand was simple avoidance dressed up as duty, an old habit of his by then. Their first meeting was in the Long Gallery, where the family portraits hang in gilt frames going back to the first Duke, and Lord Edmund's likeness, painted the winter before he sailed, laughing, one hand on a spaniel's head, hung nearest the window, freshly draped in black crape the Duke himself had ordered, and no one, on pain of his temper, was permitted to remove. I was crossing the gallery with an armful of linens bound for the west wing when I heard his step, quick and hard on the parquet the way it had become since the news, and I saw Mrs. Alder standing before the portrait with her head tilted, studying it the way one studies a thing one means to understand rather than merely admire. You are looking at my brother, the Duke said, in the voice he used for servants who had blundered and tenants who had asked for more time on their rents, flat, correct, and utterly without warmth. She did not startle, which I think surprised him. I am, your Grace, Mrs. Alder. I've been engaged as companion to the Duchess. I am aware of the arrangement. He came further into the gallery, and I set my linens down on a bench, unwilling to leave, though I told myself it was only that the hall wanted straightening. I would ask that you not linger before that portrait. It distresses the household. Does it distress you, your Grace, or the household? I have rarely seen a man's face close so fast, like a door drawn shut against a wind. I beg your pardon. I only wondered, she said, and her voice was not insolent, only very steady, because I have found that when people tell me a thing distresses the household, they generally mean it distresses them, and they have simply not the practice any more of saying so plainly. You are impertinent for a woman a week in this house. I am plain-spoken for a woman who has buried a husband, your Grace, which does tend to burn the impertinence question right out of a person. One learns rather quickly which things are worth being delicate about, and grief is very rarely one of them. He looked at her for a long moment. I remember it because it was the first time in 2 years I had seen my master truly look at anyone, rather than through them on his way to somewhere else. And then he said, "Lo, you know nothing of my grief, madam," and walked on, his step harder than ever, and did not look back at the portrait or at her. She did not call after him. She only turned back to the painting a moment longer, and I saw her lips move, though I could not hear what she said, before she gathered her skirts and went on to the Duchess's rooms as though nothing at all had passed. I confess I thought that was the whole of their acquaintance, a single sharp exchange destined to sour into mutual avoidance. I was wrong, and glad of it, though it took its time proving me so. It was the small things that began it, though I did not recognize them for what they were until much later, the way one only sees the shape of a coastline after the ship has cleared the harbor. She began leaving things in his study. Not conspicuously, she never mentioned it to him, or to the Duchess, or to me, though I noticed, because noticing is a great part of what a valet is for. A slim volume of poems on the corner of his desk one afternoon, when I knew for a fact she had gone in only to fetch the Duchess's spectacles case. A newspaper folded open to a notice about a naval widows' fund, which he read. I saw him read it, standing at his desk with his jaw tight, before he refolded it very precisely and said nothing to anyone. He rescented it. I want to be honest about that, because a story told only in soft colors is not the true color of that house that autumn. He came to me one evening in November, while I laid out his things for dinner, and said, without greeting, "Has Mrs. Alder been instructed to concern herself with my study?" "Not to my knowledge, your grace." "Then she has taken it upon herself." "It would seem so, your grace." "I do not require a widow's charity." His voice had an edge to it I had heard directed at tenants who tried his patience, at solicitors who brought him bad news, never before at anyone in his own house who had done him no harm at all. "I am not an object for her ministrations." "No, your grace," I said, because there was no arguing with him in that temper, and because I had learned in 11 years that the surest way to make him dig in was to suggest he was wrong before he had tired himself out proving it. "Shall I ask her to desist?" He was silent long enough that I thought he had forgotten the question. Then, "No," he said shortly, and turned away to the window, and I finished laying out his coat and said nothing more, because I had heard, under the sharpness, something that was not quite anger. It was closer to a man standing very still in a current he did not want to admit was moving him. She did not stop, of course, and slowly, so slowly that I could not have named the week it happened, I began to see him read the things she left. Not with pleasure, not at first. With the wary, resentful attention of a man taking medicine he has been told, against his will, that he needs. The hinge on which that whole autumn swung came in the garden in late November, on a day cold enough that I would not have expected either of them out in it. And yet there they both were. Half an hour apart by an accident I have always suspected was rather less accident than it appeared. I had gone out to see about the last of the dahlias, and so I was near enough, behind the yew hedge, to see the whole of it without either of them marking me there. Which I did not arrange, I promise you, though I have never regretted failing to remove myself once I understood what I was witnessing. The Duke stood at the far end of the walk, near the stone bench overlooking the cliff path and the gray sea beyond, his hands locked behind his back in the posture he used when he meant to be alone. Mrs. Alder came down the walk with a shawl clutched at her throat, plainly meaning only to take some air, and stopped short when she saw him, and I watched her decide, in perhaps 2 seconds, not to turn back. "Forgive me, your grace, I did not know you walked here." "I walk here most days at this hour. I had thought it was known well enough that I might be left to it." "Then I'll go," she said, and turned to go. And it was he who spoke again, which surprised me nearly as much as it seemed to surprise him. "You needn't. A pause, stiff as a man forcing a key into a lock that did not want to turn. The bench is wide enough. She came and sat, though not close, a careful, correct distance that was itself a kind of courtesy, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and I nearly took that as my signal to see to my dahlias and leave them to their silence. But then he spoke again, low, looking out at the sea and not at her. My brother used to say this was the best view on the whole coast. He'd stand just there, a small motion of his chin toward the cliff path, and say he could see clear to France on a good day, which was nonsense, but he said it every time regardless. What was he like? She asked. Not gently, not with the careful hush people use when they mean to handle a grief like a hot dish, as the Duchess had said. Simply asked as one asks after any brother. Loud, the Duke said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was its nearer cousin. Foolish, in the ways that make a house glad rather than sorry. He wanted to go to sea since he was 7 years old, and I could never talk him out of it, though God knows I tried. The near smile went out like a snuffed candle. I told him, the last time I saw him, that he was a reckless fool and that our mother would grieve herself into the grave if anything happened to him. I did not tell him I loved him. I assumed there would be time. There is never time, Mrs. Alder said. Not really. My husband and I quarreled the morning he left for his ship, over nothing, over some trifle I cannot even properly recall now, and I let him go without a kind word because I was certain there would be a next leave, a next letter, a next chance to make it right. There was a next letter. There was no next chance. The Duke turned to look at her then, and I saw on his face something I had not seen since before the black-bordered letter came. Not the flat correctness he wore like armor, but a kind of raw attention, as though she had said aloud a thing he had carried alone so long. He had half convinced himself no one could understand its weight. You loved your husband, he said. It was not quite a question. Very much. And I am angry at him still some days for dying, which I am told is not a proper thing to feel and which I have stopped apologizing for feeling regardless. It is not fair, Your Grace, that men who chose to serve their country should be made into saints the moment the sea takes them, when they were only ever men, with tempers and foolishness and mornings when they said unkind things to their wives before walking out the door forever. I loved my husband. I am also furious with him. Both are true, and grief does not require me to choose between them. I had never, in all my years with him, seen the Duke's face do what it did then. Not weeping, he did not weep, not that day. It was something more like a wall giving way at one corner, a single stone shifting after years of pressure, so that, for the space of a breath, I could see straight through into the room he had kept so carefully locked. I am angry at Edmund too, he said, very quietly, as though the words cost him something to spend. I have not said that to a living soul. I am angry that he went to sea at all when he might have stayed and lived a long, dull, safe life that would have bored him to tears, and I am angry that he is dead, and I am angriest of all that I am now Duke of a house I never wanted to inherit, because inheriting it meant losing him, and there is no ledger entry, Mrs. Alder, no column in any book I have ever balanced, that makes that arithmetic come right. No, she agreed. There isn't. I have looked for one too. They sat a while longer in the first easy silence that Garden had held in 2 years. Then the cold got the better of them, and they rose and walked back some careful 3 feet apart, speaking of nothing more consequential than the dahlias, which I made a great show of examining as they passed, so neither would guess how long I had stood there with my shears forgotten. I went in to lay out his evening things with my chest strangely tight, because I had just watched something in my master begin to breathe again after 2 years of holding its breath, and I did not yet know if it would live. It did not go smoothly from there, and I would be doing this account a disservice to pretend that a single conversation on a cold bench mended 2 years of a man's careful ruin. He was short with her again within the week, sharper, if anything, as though the Garden conversation had frightened him with its own honesty, and he meant to punish himself or her for having let it happen. She had suggested mildly over dinner that the shipping news might be easier read aloud than left folded on his desk, since the Duchess so plainly wished to hear it, and he so plainly avoided reading it to her himself. "You will not instruct me in my duties to my own mother," he said, in a voice gone cold and clipped, the voice I remembered from the worst of the early days after the news came, and the Duchess flinched, and I saw Mrs. Alder's chin come up, not in anger exactly, but in the particular steadiness of a woman who has decided she will not be made small. "I would not presume to instruct a duke in anything, your grace," she said. "I only observe that her grace listens for the shipping columns every morning as though they might one day contain different news than they do, and that it costs her something each time she must ask a servant to read them to her because her own son cannot bear to sit with her while she listens. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because someone in this house ought to, and it appears the task has fallen to the companion, since it falls to no one else." The silence that followed was the worst I had heard in that dining room in all my years of service. The Duke set down his fork with a precision more alarming than any violence, said, "You forget yourself, madam," and left the table, and I thought that night he would have her dismissed before morning. He did not. I do not know what passed in his mind, whether pride or shame or something gentler beneath both, but in the morning he was in the yellow drawing-room before his mother had come down, standing at the window with the shipping notices in his hand, reading them over as though rehearsing. He did not acknowledge me, and when the Duchess came in he sat with her, stiff as a man attending his own execution, and read her the columns himself, his voice flat and careful, until he came to a line about a fund raised for the widows of the Intrepid's crew, and his voice caught just slightly on the word widows, and the Duchess reached over and put her hand on his sleeve, and he did not pull away. Mrs. Alder was not in the room for that. I think she had arranged not to be, though I could not say how a woman arranges such a thing without seeming to. But I told her of it later, in the passage outside the still room, because I could not carry the sight of it alone. "He read to her," I said, "the whole column." "He has not done that since before the news came." She did not smile, not quite, but something eased in her face, the particular ease of a person who has planted a thing in poor soil and begun, at last, to see the first green shoot of it. "Good," she said. "That is very good, Mr. Barrow." "You did that," I said. "Whatever you said to him at dinner, whatever it cost you to say it in front of her grace, you did that." "I only said what was true. What he does with a true thing said to him is entirely his own doing, Mr. Barrow. I take no credit for another man's courage." She paused, and something more private crossed her face, quickly hidden. "Though I confess I am glad of it. He does not deserve to grieve alone in a house full of people who love him, and do not know how to say so." I did not know, then, quite how much of her own grief lived behind that sentence. I would learn it soon enough, and so, more painfully, would he. December came in hard and gray, and it was in that cold that the Duke's temper, softening by such small degrees I had almost begun to trust it, broke wide open one afternoon in a way that frightened even me. It began with something small. A junior groom had let one of the Duchess's spaniels, the very dog that had sat for the portrait beside Lord Edmund years before, grown old now and much loved, wander too near the cliff path, and the animal had come to grief on the rocks below, not killed but badly hurt. The Duke's fury when he heard it was a thing I had not seen since the earliest black days of his mourning. He did not shout, which was somehow worse. He went very still and told the groom, in a voice like a blade drawn slow from its sheath, that he was dismissed without character, that Highmore had no use for men who could not be trusted with a dog, let alone a fortune, and the boy, no more than 17, weeping openly by then, was sent from the house within the hour, and the Duke retreated to his study and would see no one for the length of an evening. I understood his fury in a way. The dog had slept by the fire in the very room where Edmund's portrait now hung draped in black, and its hurt was, I think, one grief standing in for another too large to be borne directly. But the boy had done nothing so very terrible, had made an ordinary mistake, and the punishment was the punishment of a man striking out because it was easier than sitting still with what he actually felt. Mrs. Alder went to him that evening. I did not see it happen. I was not fool enough to hover at his study door a second time in 1 week. But I saw her come out an hour later with her color high and her jaw set in a way I had not seen before, and I heard, faintly, the tail end of a considerable exchange. And I will not be lectured on mercy by a woman who has known this house a bare 2 months, his voice, hard as I had ever heard it. Then be lectured on it by yourself, your grace, because I think somewhere under all that ice you know precisely how unjust you have just been to a boy who is guilty of nothing worse than youth. You did not dismiss him for the dog. You dismissed him because you needed somewhere to put 2 years of grief you have refused to let anyone see, and a frightened groom was simply nearest to hand when the dam broke. That is not justice. That is cruelty wearing justice's coat, and I think you know it, or you would not have shouted so long at me instead of simply telling me to leave. I did not hear his answer if he gave one, but within 2 days the groom's dismissal was quietly reversed, his character restored, a note sent to his family with an additional month's wages in recognition of service. The Duke's way, I have come to understand, of admitting a wrong without ever once using the word wrong aloud. He did not speak to Mrs. Alder for the better part of a week after that quarrel, and the silence cost him more than his temper ever had, because a man who has begun to feel again cannot go back to not feeling merely by refusing to speak. I saw him at his study window more than once that week, watching the garden where she walked with the Duchess, his face showing something I can only call hunger, not for anything improper, for he was too honorable a man, and she too dignified a woman for that even in thought, but a hunger for the particular honesty she brought into every room, which he had gone 2 years without, and now found he could not do without again. It was the Duchess, of all people, who broke that silence, though I do not think she knew, when she did it, quite what she was mending. She took a chill in the 2nd week of December, nothing so grave as it first appeared, though we did not know that at the time, and the physician was sent for, and the whole house held its breath the way houses do when they have already lost too much. The Duke sat by his mother's bed 2 full nights running, which he had not done even in the first terrible days after Edmund's death, when his own grief had made him nearly unable to bear the sight of hers. Mrs. Alder was there too, spelling him when he would allow it, and it was in the gray hour before dawn on the 2nd night, with the Duchess finally sleeping easy and the fever broken, that I found the 2 of them sitting on either side of the bed, not speaking, the Duke's hand resting not 2 inches from hers on the counterpane, neither of them moving, as though some unspoken treaty held them each in place. "She'll do well now," Mrs. Alder said softly when she saw me in the doorway. "The fever's broken, she only needs rest." "Thank you," the Duke said, and I do not think he meant only the 2 words. I think he meant the whole autumn, the books left on his desk, the shipping columns, the courage to tell him he was wrong when no one else in that house would dare it. She seemed to understand that too, for something passed over her face that was not quite a smile, and was considerably warmer than one. "You needn't thank me, your grace. I have only done what any decent person would." "You have done what no one else in this house managed to do in 2 years, he said low. "You have made my mother's grief bearable to sit beside, and you have done something else besides, which I am only beginning to understand how to say." She waited. I confess I waited too, forgetting entirely that I had a fire to see to and had no business lingering in a doorway like a housemaid at a keyhole. "You have made mine bearable as well," he said. "I did not ask for that. I did not want it, if I am honest. I had built myself rather a comfortable prison out of not feeling anything at all, and you have gone and knocked a window into the wall of it whether I liked it or not, and I find, to my very great surprise, that I do like it, though it has cost me something to admit as much." Grief is not meant to be a prison, your grace, she said. It is only meant to be carried. There is a difference, though it took me the better part of a year to learn it myself. Teach me the difference, he said, and it was not, I think, entirely about grief that he asked it, though neither said the other thing aloud, not in a sick room with his mother sleeping 3 feet away and propriety standing sentry over every word between them. I withdrew at last, because even Barrow knows when a room no longer wants a fire tended, and went below with my own eyes rather wetter than I would have liked to admit to the scullery maid who caught me wiping them. The Duchess mended within the week, and Christmas came to Highmore for the first time in 2 years with something like its old spirit, though a subdued and careful version of it, the way a garden looks in its first spring after a hard frost, not yet lush but undeniably, gratefully alive. It was the day after Twelfth Night, the last of the greenery coming down, when the Duke did a thing I would not have believed possible of him 4 months before. He asked Mrs. Alder to walk with him in the garden, not the accident of 2 people arriving separately and finding the bench occupied, but a plain, deliberate invitation, given in the front hall before me and 2 footmen and the Duchess herself, without a trace of his old flat correctness. "The frost has made the walk treacherous in patches," he said. "I should not like you to go alone." "I have walked that path alone 100 times since October, your grace, in every weather Highmore has offered." "I am aware. I should still like to walk it with you today, if you would permit it." A pause, and then, with a rawness that startled us all, "I find I no longer wish to walk it alone either." The Duchess said nothing, but I saw her smile, a real smile, the first in 2 years not shadowed at its edges by something unspoken, and understood she had seen this coming a good deal longer than the rest of us. I did not follow them into the garden. Some things even a devoted valet leaves properly alone. But I saw them return an hour later, walking rather closer together than the careful 3 feet of autumn had allowed, the Duke's face carrying a color and an ease I had not seen since before the black-bordered letter, and Mrs. Alder's hand, for just a moment as they crossed the threshold, resting lightly on his sleeve in a manner that was not merely the courtesy of a companion to her employer's son. He came to me that evening while I laid out his things for dinner, and stood a long while at the window before he spoke, which was his old habit from before, the one I had not seen in 2 years and had nearly forgotten to hope for. "Barrow," he said, "I believe I have made rather a poor showing of myself these 2 years past." "Your grace has grieved a terrible loss," I said, careful as I always was with him in such moments, not to presume too far. "I do not think anyone in this house would call that a poor showing." "I grieved by making myself into a man no one could reach," he said. "I told myself it was strength. It was only fear, dressed up very finely in a duke's coat. I did not want to feel what feeling my brother's death honestly would cost me, and so I built a great many ledgers between myself and the feeling and called the ledgers duty, and thought myself very responsible for it." He turned from the window at last. She would not let me keep the ledgers between us. She never once tried to comfort me the way everyone else did, with soft words and softer silences that asked nothing of me at all. She told me the truth of her own grief, plainly, and left me no honest place to hide from my own. "I have watched it happen, your grace, these 4 months," I said, "and perhaps I overstepped, but 11 years earns a man some little liberty. I have been glad of every day of it." He looked at me then with something almost like his old warmth, the warmth I remembered from before the news came, and said, "I mean to ask her to stay at Highmore, Barrow, not as my mother's companion only. If she'll have me, and I do not know that she will, for I have given her precious little reason these 4 months to think well of my temper, I mean to ask her to be my wife." I will own that my hands were not perfectly steady as I brushed down his coat that evening, and that I made rather more noise about it than the task required, and that he noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of kindness between us, a valet and his master, after so many hard years. He asked her 3 days later in the same garden, on the same stone bench where they had first spoken honestly to one another, with the sea gray and restless below the cliff path and the last of the season's frost silvering the grass. And I was not there to hear the words themselves, whatever license I have taken elsewhere in this account. Some rooms and some benches belong only to the two people who sat on them, and I will not pretend otherwise merely to satisfy a curiosity, even my own. But I know what I saw when they came back to the house an hour later, her hand resting easily in the crook of his arm now, no careful distance left between them at all, and her face turned up to his with an openness I had not seen in her before, not even in her kindest hours with the Duchess, and his face bent toward hers with an expression I can only call cherished, though I had not thought, 4 months before, that word would ever again belong to that house. "Barrow," he said, when he saw me crossing the hall, and there was a lightness in his voice I had genuinely believed gone from the world, "you will wish us happy, I think." "I do, your grace," I said, and found my voice thicker than I meant it to be. "I do, with my whole heart, and I believe I speak for the whole household in it." Mrs. Alder, though I understood already she would not keep that name much longer, looked at me with an expression I had come to know well over 4 months, warm and direct and entirely without artifice. "Thank you, Mr. Barrow, for your kindness to me since October. I know a valet sees a great deal more of a house's true weather than anyone gives him credit for." "I have seen a great deal this autumn, ma'am," I said. "I have seen a man remember how to feel his own grief instead of only guarding against it, and I have seen a woman brave enough to say true things in a house that had forgotten how to hear them. I do not think I will see a finer thing in service, however many years I have left in it." She married him in February, in the small chapel at Highmore rather than in town, which suited them both, I think, neither of them being people who required a crowd to know what they had found in each other. The Duchess wept through the whole of the short ceremony, and laughed through her tears in the same breath, which I had thought, 4 months before, an impossible combination for that particular lady to manage again in this life, and which I was very glad to be proven wrong about. I will say only this more, and then I will let this account close, for a valet's place is to see and to serve, not to speak longer than the matter warrants. The portrait of Lord Edmund still hangs in the long gallery, though the black crape came down that same February at the Duke's own order, and in its place his valet, myself, though I confess it was her suggestion, made gently, the way she suggested everything that mattered, arranged for a small bowl of fresh flowers to stand on the table beneath it, changed each week. So that the young man who had loved the sea and this house and his brother so well might be remembered not only in mourning, but in the ordinary gladness of a house that had learned, at last, to go on living around its grief instead of merely enduring beside it. I have watched the new Duchess these months since, in the mornings when she reads the shipping columns aloud herself now, without anyone having to ask it of her, her husband's hand resting easy over hers on the newspaper's page, and I have thought more than once that Highmore was a house of ravens for 2 long years, black-clad and silent, and circling its own sorrow with nowhere to land. It is not that any longer. She saw to that, one honest word and one small unasked kindness at a time, and if I have learned anything in 11 years of watching a good man nearly lose himself and then, by grace of a woman who understood exactly what he refused to feel, find his way home again, it is only this, that the wound a person hides best is very often the one that most wants and most deserves to be truly seen. I was fortunate enough to watch it happen. I do not expect, in whatever years of service remain to me, to see a finer thing. There is a coda to it, small and domestic, that I set down only because it is the last picture I have of that autumn and winter, and because I think it says more plainly than anything else what had changed in that house. It was March by then, the frost gone soft out of the ground and the first snowdrops showing along the garden wall, and I came into the yellow drawing-room one afternoon to find the Duke on his knees on the hearthrug, a posture I could not have imagined him in 4 months before, dignity being another of the armors he had worn so long he had forgot it was armor at all. Helping his wife wind a great skein of wool that the Duchess had been threatening to knit into a shawl since November, and had never quite managed alone. "You are meant to hold it steady, Your Grace," the new Duchess was saying, laughter plain in her voice, "not strangle it. I am attempting a difficult commission, madam, and I will thank you not to mock a man doing his sincere best. Your sincere best has put 3 knots in perfectly good wool. Then I shall have Barrow dismiss himself for failing to instruct me in wool management, since it plainly was not covered in my education." "Barrow," I said from the doorway, unable to help myself, "was never consulted on wool, Your Grace, and begs to be excused from any blame in the matter." They both looked up at me and laughed, actually laughed, together, easily, the sound of it filling that room in a way I had genuinely feared in the worst months of his mourning, that I would never hear again in that house. And the old Duchess, watching from her chair with her mended color and her contented eyes, caught my glance across the room and held it a moment, and I understood, without either of us needing to say it, that we were both thinking the same thought, that grief, given time and honesty and one particular woman's steady courage, need not be the last word a house speaks. It can, if it is carried rather than buried, become the very floor on which a new happiness learns to stand. I left them to their wool and their laughter and went to see about the tea, and I will confess that I took the long way round by the gallery, past Edmund's portrait with its fresh flowers underneath, and stood a moment before it myself, and said quietly, to a young man who could not hear me and who I like to think somehow did regardless, that his brother was well now, truly well, and that the house he had loved so much was, after a long hard winter, finally warm again. Then I went on to my tea things, because a house must be run whatever the state of the hearts inside it, and because I had, after 11 years of watching and waiting, finally been given a story worth the keeping.